Franklin Roosevelt, a president we thought we knew so well, elected to an unprecedented 4 terms.
That the only thing we have to fear is fear itself.
He charted a course through the 2 greatest crises of the last century.
I have seen war, and I hate war.
Roosevelt, a man of vision, ruthlessness, and relentless drive. But there was a private side, one that FDR tried so hard to conceal. A 24-year struggle with paralysis, an affair that almost destroyed his marriage, and the loneliness that darkened his final days. Rare home movies take us into his cloistered world. A private diary kept by a cousin details his dramatic physical decline.
The president's breathing became very heavy. At that moment, the heavy breathing stopped.
After 60 years, an infinitely more complex man emerges from the shadows. They came to Washington by the thousands. Defying the blistering cold to bear witness to history. The inauguration of an American president. FDR left the White House to drive down Pennsylvania Avenue towards the Capitol. The year was 1941. After 8 tumultuous years as president, Roosevelt, with 54% of the vote, had been re-elected for an unprecedented 3rd term.
That I will faithfully execute the office of President of the United States.
History would look kindly on the patrician that spoke the language of the dispossessed.
I share the view of almost all historians that Franklin Delano Roosevelt is the greatest president of the 20th century. And beyond this, I think that the policies he adopted to deal with this terrible crisis of the Great Depression are the most imaginative, the most creative of any president in our history.
But fortunately for Roosevelt, the 1940 election had not served as a referendum on the imaginative policies of the past. The nation was still reeling from the effects of the Great Depression. Unemployment, which 8 years earlier had stood at 25%, still hovered close to 20%. FDR's victory was secured less for what he had achieved, and more as a result of his promise to keep American boys out of the fight against Adolf Hitler.
A good way of thinking about Roosevelt is, what if there was no World War? And so there was no reason for him to suddenly run for a 3rd term. He couldn't have run for a 3rd term. He would have been voted into oblivion.
Voted into oblivion because Americans were counting the cost of Roosevelt's revolution. Many insisted the president bore responsibility for expanding the reach of government beyond constitutional boundaries. His grade that winter's day was at best an incomplete. Our assessment of the president begins 9 years earlier, on the eve of his first race for the White House. America was in the depths of the greatest economic downturn in its history.
There were some commentators by 1932 who believed that they were watching the end of an historical era in which laissez-faire free market capitalism was absolutely imploding and proving its historical bankruptcy.
The evidence of decline was everywhere. 13 million Americans were out of work, millions living beyond the point of despair. Soup kitchens and squatter camps reflected the new reality. These were the worst of times. After 4 years in power, the Republican incumbent Herbert Hoover was a beaten man. He insisted that the Wall Street crash of October 1929 was a result of economic forces beyond his or anyone else's control. Not so, argued the supremely self-confident and charismatic governor of New York, Franklin Delano Roosevelt. who, at the age of 50, was seeking the Democratic nomination for president.
And suddenly this sunburst appeared, who seemed utterly unruffled by all this. He seemed as if Americans could do anything, and he would lead them where they wanted to go, and he was going to restore hope.
Roosevelt hardly seemed a likely champion of the dispossessed. Yet in the summer of 1932, this product of privilege refused to accept that the great American experiment was doomed.
This is more than a political campaign. It is a call to arms. Give me your help, not to win votes alone, but to win in this crusade to restore America to its own people.
In essence, Roosevelt ascended to the presidency when he accepted that nomination. In the 1932 election, he had one overwhelming advantage. He wasn't the incumbent. Roosevelt won nearly 60% of the popular vote. He accepted the affirmation of the nation from his home in Hyde Park along New York's Hudson River. For the last time, an American president would have to wait 4 months between election and taking office. Inauguration Day, Saturday, March 4th, 1933. The day opened with a service at St. John Episcopal Church in Washington. Frances Perkins, Roosevelt's selection for Labor Secretary, attended the service. She wrote in her diary, "We were in a terrible situation. If ever a man wanted to pray, that was the day. Franklin did want to pray, and he wanted everyone to pray for him." Under threatening skies and a cold northerly wind, FDR appeared supremely confident. His words reaffirmed his abiding faith in America and his determination to carry the nation back to prosperity.
This great nation will endure as it has endured, will revive and will prosper. So first of all, let me assert my firm belief that the only thing we have to fear is fear itself, nameless, unreasoning, unjustified terror, which paralyzes needed effort to convert retreat into advance.
The most important thing he brought into the presidency in 1933 was this contagious confidence that he felt in himself and in his countrymen, so that even from that first speech, the inaugural speech, it's almost as if he projected his confidence onto the people, and they're saying to themselves, if he believes in us, then we believe in ourselves.
Roosevelt made it clear that he was demanding broad executive authority to reverse the ravages wrought by economic stagnation.
Roosevelt is saying to the country, you have a leader now, and you have a leader who is not afraid of exercising power. I'm willing to exercise power as though the Great Depression were a war, as though we were being invaded by a foreign foe, and I'm going to be your commander-in-chief in this war against the Depression.
The first day of his term, he was faced with the imminent collapse of the nation's banking system. Hundreds of institutions had already gone under. Thousands more stood on the brink of ruin. On the morning after the inauguration, FDR ordered the banks to close for the next 4 days in a desperate attempt to stem the tide of withdrawals. He brought bankers and politicians together, demanding that they resolve their differences and come up with a plan to solve the problem.